Is the relationship between listening and storytelling. Now we're going to look at the relationship of people telling stories and people listening to stories. And we've been talking about Alfred North Whitehead for the last couple of sessions on Enthinkment Circle, that you can find more about it in thinkment.com. Whitehead says truth is a qualification which applies to appearance only, or appearance alone. Reality is just itself. Truth, says Whitehead, is the confirmation of appearance to reality. That's in The Adventures of Ideas, page 24. Truth is a generic quality with a variety of degrees and modes. So when it comes to truth and what we call true storytelling, we have to ask, is there a true story? How do we understand that true story? In the face of logocentrism, Jacques Derrida. And is there a particular logos that's an original story? A logos that's an ideal story? Where is that located? So we have a metaphysical significance to this notion of true storytelling that we must explore. Is a true story just the words and the language? Is a story a fundamental expression of some external reality? True storytelling has a metaphysical challenge, right? Is there an original story and then the replicators are getting it correct or incorrect? Or is storytelling always happening, always changing, right? And simultaneous storytelling in different parts of an organizational life. Different rooms, different buildings, different floors. Organizations are storytelling simultaneously in different rooms. So the teller has their notion of what's true, and the listener has their notion of what's true. So think of the blind men and the elephant, where one person touches the tail and it's a snake, another touches the trunk, right? And what is it, a log or something? Some kind of hose? They touch a leg and it's a tree. They touch an ear, right? It's a big fan. So obviously they are all standing in what they think is the truth of their story, listening to one another. Now, if we look at Jacques Derrida and his notion of logocentrism, we want to be understanding that we don't want true storytelling to fall into the trap of Western logocentrism, where there's one grand narrative that's taken to be what's true, or the narrative that the boss tells us, right, or the official narrative, right? So we want to understand this notion of logocentrism. So the word sign and the sound sign, Jacques Derrida, a critique of Ferdinand de Saussure, who lived 1857 to 1913, and Derrida wants to say, hey, Saussure privileged the sound sign over the written sign, and it doesn't necessarily have to be so. Writing can be completely complex, and Derrida is also concerned that the ideal, in our case the ideal story, being completely phonetic, maybe one that's completely written is also getting closer to what's true. But in true storytelling, we don't want it to become a logocentric project where we're saying, oh, that's the true story, like we're some kind of court of law and people are swearing on the Bible that what they're saying is true. So there's the metaphysics of the logos, the metaphysics of this way of thinking that there's an original story, or there's this story that we can find out through science and get closer and closer to what's true using the scientific method. So let me give it to you in a nutshell. Can true storytelling reject forms of logocentrism, right? The original, or the true form. That's very Plato-oriented. And can we sift instead through the social, historical, the contingents, the contextual, and as Alfred North Whitehead was telling us, to look at different kinds of ground and different ways of grounding this relationships between the appearance and the representation. So we're challenging the privileging of any grand narrative because it omits so much history, so much of the social voices are excluded. The environmental voices are excluded, the cellular voices excluded, right? Cellular society, molecular society. So it doesn't really, logocentrism doesn't really work that well in the quantum era. So the teller, must they be present? If we look at Roland Barthes, 1915 to 1980, his 1968 essay, The Death of the Author, if the author is dead and we're reading or hearing a story as told by Roland Barthes, do we privilege that? Or is the author dead and now that story in 2024 can take on all kinds of different meanings and twists given the context that we're in, the social, the historical, the material, the discourses that are happening. So we talked before about the presence metaphysics, right? So obviously the death of the author is no longer present, but they're there in their writing, and maybe we have some recordings on YouTube or some such thing, and we're able to hear the audio. But the author's in a very different context than we're in, right? So does the narrative only have one happening in the present, a collection of a few characters and a few elements and scenes constructed into a grander narrative? That's a very linear way of assembling a beginning, middle, and end. And you know my writing on Tamara-Land, after the play Tamara, that storytelling is happening simultaneously in different rooms, different buildings of an organization or a nation, different states in the world, different nations and states and buildings, etc. So there's a lot of simultaneous storytelling. So storytelling ends up being very multidimensional. So we have the tellers of these stories simultaneously, and you have listeners of these stories simultaneously. And we have this shifting context of the social and historical and the material. So metaphysical presence is a very problematic notion that just the present storytelling is true, being in the so-called here and now. But you can parse out that now into finer and finer gradations, so you can't even find the now, right? So if we say logocentric is the belief that there's this story that can be designated and identified as original, and that has, in the second phase, some referent to the real world that we're believing in, that definition is going to get us into trouble. So true storytelling can reject forms of logocentrism by engaging in storytelling circles, the sharing of stories, so we can share the social, share the different histories, share the contingencies, get a better appreciation of contextualism, and challenging the privilege of a grand narrative hegemony, its power to confine meaning to itself, when we need to look at the traces of all the editing out of the voices, right? Now, do all of the cultures in the world, are they logocentric? And the answer is probably no. There's probably cultures there, I think of indigenous places, indigenous peoples in places that do not have the Western logocentric. And they have what's called the living story, where the living story has a mind, a place, and a time of its own. And as Joe Tyler tells us, there's an aliveness to living story. Living story, right? Kalen Tutre's construct from 1996 that I've always advocated since I learned about it. And So the story has a life of its own. The materiality of the singular has a life of its own. And so we have the tellers and the listeners and the material discursive, as Karen Barad would talk about it. So in other words, let's not fall into the trap of combining true storytelling, in a book I wrote with Jens and Lorna about true storytelling, and look at the processes. Storytelling is a process. And if we just stop that process in the present and fixate on particular grand narrative presence, we're going to miss the historical shifts and all the things going on, all right? So that's it. I'm David Boje, a professor, about 45 years studying storytelling, mainly in the organizational world. And so we want to sort of flesh out the Tamara, the simultaneous telling of stories in many different places and times, and respect what Roland Barthes called the death of the author of those stories. Thank you very much. Again, this is inthinkment.com. We meet every Tuesday, 1 p.m. Mountain Time, New Mexico time. So go to inthinkment.com. You can find out how to log in. Thank you for listening. All the best to you. Bye.